Okay. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our virtual lecture series in general surgery. Today is the 6th series, and I'll hand over the proceedings to Dr. Niranjan Agarwal, and then I'll introduce the chairpersons. Yeah.
Good evening, friend, once again to this MSS lecture series in general surgery, which is the 6th this Friday. The next Friday, 7th, will be on disease of the varicose veins, and it will be varicose vein, DVT, and venous ulcers. And I need to make few announcements before we go on with these lectures today. On the 6th of June, we'll have a webinar. It's a Sunday in the morning, which will be on safe cholecystectomy, and we have got panelists from Dr. Abhay Dalvi, Dr. Amol Bapaya, and Dr. Siddesh, and Dr. Deep Goyal, and Dr. Roy Patankar will be moderating that session. So it's free for everybody. You can join that session. But on 13th of June, we have a full day conference on wound, that is WoundCon. So we will be discussing the entire gamut of diabetic food problems, starting from the newer ointments or newer local application, newer dressing materials, newer investigations, and all the existing modalities, how they have changed, followed by a discussion on a pressure source. So that will be a full day program, and it will require registration. Soon the announcement will be made. That will have credit hours also. So all of you keep yourself free for these 2 dates which I just mentioned. Friday, of course, 9 to 11, we request you to keep yourself free for the surgery lecture series. And with this announcement, I first thank the speakers who have agreed to talk today at a short notice and are here with you with their talks, and the chairpersons will be moderating them. And thank you, Juventus, for supporting us in this endeavor. Over to you, Rajesh. Please carry on forward.
Yeah. Thank you, Niranjan. We'll start the session. I'll introduce the 2 chairpersons. Dr. Dharmashri Kadam, who is a senior consultant and DNB teacher. He's at VN Desai Municipal Hospital. His attachments are Raheja Hospital, Guru Nanak Hospital, and Surya Hospital. He's a very good laparoscopic surgeon. And the second chairperson is Dr. K. Maxwell. He's a consulting surgeon at Nanavati Max Hospital, Guru Nanak, and SL Raheja Hospital, an excellent teacher and a laparoscopic surgeon. So I hand over the proceedings to Dr. Maxwell and Dr. Kadam to introduce the speakers, and we'll start the session without wasting time. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Dear friends, welcome you all to attend this wonderful session organized by Mumbai Surgical Society. We are very grateful to our President, Dr. Niranjan Agarwal, and Secretary, Dr. Rajesh Yadav, to organizing these wonderful sessions. So far, we already completed 5 sessions. These are 6 sessions. Today, we are having 3 sessions. In that first session is about the wound healing and management by Dr. Smurti Jakla Madam. For the surgeons, the helping wound is so important. After a major surgery, sometimes you'll be doing for 5 hours, 6 hours. And second day, third day, when you open the wound, if you find little infection, then your stress level will go very high. So now I'm inviting Dr. Smurti Jakla Madam to deliver your lecture. Madam is a HOD and Professor of Surgery in HBT Medical College and Cooper Hospital. Madam has a good experience, more than 22 years in her field, and it's her special interest in wound management, especially the diabetic food. I think this year she has started a special clinic for the diabetes in Cooper Hospital, and she is a DNB teacher and teacher for the FCPS surgeons students also. Madam, please deliver your lecture, madam. I'm inviting you to madam. Thank you, madam.
Thank you so much. Am I audible?
Yes, you are audible, madam.
You are audible, slightly loud.
Is it okay? This is better?
Yeah, that's fine.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you for your kind words, Dr. Maxwell. And I thank Niranjan, Dr. Niranjan and Dr. Rajesh Yadav for personally reaching out to me and inviting me for this particular session. My talk today entails wound healing, factors affecting and contributing towards it. Now, as we all know, right from undergraduate days, this is the kind of a topic probably which most undergraduates would not be present in the lecture halls, right from biochemistry, physiology, or maybe even surgical. It's only later that people who have taken up surgery, the MBBS doctors and the residents who have taken up surgical branches, do we understand the importance of wound healing and what it entails? Well, I would like to begin by saying that time heals all wounds. Now, this can be a metaphorical statement, but we all are surgeons out here, and we know how true it is literally that we have to give time to any wound that comes, whether it's acute or chronic. Now, without going into the details about what acute and chronic entails right now, let me just begin with a brief introduction about how does one go about healing wounds. The aim of any healing of any wound.
Smruti, sorry to interrupt you. Have you started sharing your screen, because we are not seeing your presentation?
I have. Sorry. Is this okay?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just
make it full screen, ma'am.
Right. I'm just 1 minute. Just give me a minute.
Aram se Aram.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes.
Sorry.
Yeah.
So, like I mentioned earlier, time heals all wounds, and this is not only metaphorical but especially for us surgeons. And why is that so? We know that any wound has to be given time. It will lead to a better job, not only in terms of less tension for the surgeon, but also early healing for the patient and relief for the patient. If I want to go back and say what wound healing or repair means, in that case, let me go back and say that it's originally derived from the Latin word called reparare, which probably means to go prepare. Or we can also say that it comes from a French word called reparer, is to go back. Eventually, what it means is to go back to the way it was earlier, to maybe restore function and integrity of the injured tissue. At the same time, if we can manage cosmetic results, that would be great. So the aim of healing would probably be to create the best conditions so that primary healing is achieved at whatever cost. Now, normal wound healing, which undergoes the various phases, as we all know, the hemostatic or the inflammatory phase, the proliferative phase, and the remodeling phase. Now, why are these phases demarcated like this? Hemostatic phase is the one that the bleeding the first occurs. Any injury that the tissue entails, there is a hemostatic phase. There is bleeding first, and then there is inflammatory phase. In the hemostatic phase, we find that the platelets clog in the capillaries, and the endothelium that is exposed with its collagen 4 or collagen 5 probably, it causes more and more amount of platelet aggregation, and this leads to an inflammatory cascade, whereby certain growth factors as well as chemokines are released, and they lead to the various next phases that are often seen in like the proliferative and the remodeling. Now, the thing in the process of repair is that in the ease to establish normal blood flow and the lymphatic flow patterns and to restore a barrier to the fluid loss and infection, it is very important to get back to the mechanical integrity of the injured tissue. And a flawless repair is sacrificed in the phase that we see. And what we get is not regeneration that is seen in fetal tissues or sometimes even in the liver as well as in the bones. But we get, or even other lesser organisms, single cell organisms, where they do regenerate. But what we probably get is a scar tissue. And why is that so? There is sequential cellular and biochemical events that restore the cellular integrity after any injury. And this happens in most mammals. Now, wound healing goes through the various phases: the phase of bleeding and the inflammation, the phase of proliferation, and the phase of remodeling or remodeling or maturation. In the inflammatory phase, the initial bleeding leads to vasoconstriction. There's thrombus formation. Platelets aggregate out there because of the endothelium that is exposed. They release ATPs. They release cytokines, and they release certain growth factors. Cytokines and the platelet-derived growth factors, as well as transformic growth factor beta, these attract more and more amount of polymorphonucleosides and the macrophages, as well as it leads to platelet aggregation. This aggregation also releases the basal granules, as well as the alpha granules, as well as the dense granules, which release vasoactive amines in the form of histamine, serotonin, and prostaglandin. Now, this further increases the vascular permeability, and we have more and more of these acute cell mediators that come into the picture. As you can see, I have taken this picture from Sebastian, that the macrophages and the polymorphonucleosides or the neutrophils, they start coming in within the first 48 or 20 to 24 hours. The other cells like monocytes, fibroblasts, they come into the play much later, maybe from the 3rd or the 5th day onwards. So in the first 48 hours, you see that what we can see probably with the naked eye is only a clot that is sitting on the injured part. But what if we see a transection of the skin and the skin, where the epidermis and the dermis is seen, then probably this kind of a microcellular picture can be seen, where you have all amount of growth hormones. We have all these cytokines in the form of interleukins, okay, which come into the picture, and they attract more and more. They act as chemoattractants, and they get the other cells into the picture. Now, in the inflammatory phase, they try to these organisms are taken care of by the neutrophils as well as the PDGF. There is lysis of the bacteria that happens. All the foreign body is taken care of, as well as because of the endothelial loss of the tissue on the basement membrane, there is more amount of plasma or the extracellular matrix that starts coming into the play. Now, the proliferative phase begins from the 3rd day to the 3rd week and mainly consists of fibroblast activity. Now, fibroblasts are not present, they are already present in the mesenchymal cells and they are not differentiated. But because of the chemoattractants and the growth factors, the mesenchymal cells, they transform themselves into fibroblast. And also these fibroblasts, because of the platelet-derived growth factors, as well as the interleukins, they start producing the collagens in the endoplasmic reticulum. Without going into the nitty-gritties of the whole thing, we should understand that neoangiogenesis begins as early as the 3rd day onwards because of the vascular endothelial growth factors and the other growth factors that come into the play in this particular region. Also, this neoangiogenesis leads to more amount of chemoattractive substances coming into the area, more amount of macrophages and lymphocytes coming into the area, and also the chemokines that get released. And there is a cascade of events that happens. The reepithelialization of wound surface is a very important thing that happens because of small proteins that are present called as integrin, which leads to adhesive progression of various cell lines, which try and restore the basic lines of the endothelial surface, as well as they try and reform into the other cells that are present out there. This entire process is called proliferative phase, and the tissue that is seen out there is called as a granulation tissue. The remodeling phase probably begins from the 2nd week onwards and is ongoing till almost 2 years and above. Here, the collagen as well as the fibroblast, it matures into collagen. Also, myofibroblasts come into the play. These collagen initially consists of only immature type, which is only type 3, and more mature types come in later, which is type 1. Now, collagen, as we all know, are more than around 20 types of collagen are present in the body, out of which the most mature type that is present in the skin and the bones is probably type 1. And type 3 is the immature type that is present in the fetal, which is more present predominantly in fetal origin. And this ratio has to be very important for maintaining the structural integrity of any organ that is getting repaired. Realignment happens along the lines of tension or the Langer's lines, as we all know. Eventually, there's decreased vascularity and the wound starts contracting, whereby the role of myofibroblasts come into the play. Now, if we just have a look at briefly at the process what we how these undergoes, then we know that wounding happens, there's coagulation, there's injured cell membrane, platelets come into the play, and the mediators out here are the phospholipase A, the prostaglandins, the interleukins are the cytokines, and the growth factors are there. In the 2nd phase, which begins from 3rd day onwards to maybe 7th day, there is more amount of inflammation and a little bit of angiogenesis that takes place. The factors that come into the play are the fibroblast growth factor, transforming growth factor beta, and maybe tumor necrosis factor alpha. Here, we have more amount of granulocytes that come into play, and lymphocytes and macrophages increase. In the 3rd phase, probably as the epithelialization and remodeling happens, there is more amount of proteoglycan synthesis, as well as more amount of collagen and deposition. The cells that come into the play are probably fibroblasts, and slowly, as epithelialization happens, along with small molecules which are called as integrin, there is epithelial cells come into play, and remodeling happens with fibroblasts and myofibroblasts for a very continuous period of time. So the various factors that come into the play are probably the interleukins, the chemokines, and the growth factor as seen here. And the cells that are involved are the monocytes, fibroblasts, and the collagens. This is in brief the process that is there, which begins immediately after the wound or the injury happens and probably goes on, okay, for more than 2 years. So any scar, we say that there is some amount of active regeneration happening for almost 6 months to 2 years, beyond 2 years. If we go to see the graph, I've taken this from Sadiston, we see that the neutrophils are there in the picture in the first 48 hours, but later the neutrophils are decreased and macrophages and lymphocytes come into the play. If we can see what kind of tissue is laid down, we can see that the early tissue is the collagen, which is collagen number 3, which it decreases in number. The collagen number 1, which is more important for structural integrity, begins from second day onwards and it keeps on increasing over a period of time. Also, there are other cells that come into the play, which go on increasing and decreasing as and when the cell lines change. Just a brief, it's an animation of the process of what I talked about earlier. There are the platelets, there are bacteria, there is fibrin that is being formed, it forms a plug, because of the increased amount of extracellular, because of the defect in the basal lamina, that you find the fluid that is escaping outside the cell, outside the endothelium, and you can find that the macrophages are taking care of the bacteria. These are the myofibroblasts that are coming in the picture, and these are activated because of the monocytes and the plasma-derived growth factor. They enter into the wound, they form scar, they form collagen, and this is how the wound heals. This is taken from the net, so I'm afraid I can't. The types of healing. Now, coming to the types of healing, we know that the wound. What I talked about earlier was acute healing, acute wounds, and there we have healing by primary intention. This is normal healing, and there is sequential progress of the wound through the various stages to go into the scar, and the scar that is formed is minimal, and because the edges are very well opposed. What happens in when we have healing by secondary intention and tertiary intention, which is also called as delayed primary, is that the wounds are left open. Maybe the opposition is not possible. Maybe there is infection out there, and we realize that the proliferative phase is a little longer standing and which goes on for a longer period of time. And that is the reason why we have granulation tissue, which is very prominent out here, and there's increased amount of inflammation. In fact, it is often seen that if you take a biopsy of this tissue, we find that the inflammatory cell mediators or the cytokines are very much increased in number, or there are very much increased in this tissue, and that leads to a chronically inflamed status and a chronically proliferating wound stage, especially in secondary intention. In a tertiary intention, something similar happens. The wound is kept open, but we are able to oppose the wound edges later. And probably that is the commonest thing what we see is when we do secondary suturing in surgical practice. So just a graphical description of what the wound looks like. This is the wound where it's healed by primary intention. This is a large wound that is healed by secondary intention. And this probably is a wound that will be healing by tertiary intentions, or also called as delayed primary. If we see the cut section of the dermis and the epidermis, we will probably find a picture like this, where there is a vascular and there are capillaries. There is a breach in the capillaries because of this the injury that has happened. These are the polymorphonucleosides and the macrophages that come into the play earlier. And this is the way the neovascularization happens with the help of VEGF as well as PDGF, and the wound heals. And because of the integrin and the other cell, the factors mentioned earlier, the reepithelialization happens from the edges. And this is secondary, the healing by tertiary intention. Now, if we talk about classification of wounds, we would probably talk in terms of why in terms of causative factors, which leads to the classification can be based on causative factors or the wound or the appearance, and that's called as Rank and Wakefield appearance classification, or maybe because of time duration or because of thickness of the wound. If you talk about the causative factors, there are multiple reasons why the wounds happen. Probably traumatic wounds, It can be infective, but can seem folliculitis or diabetic, or they can be iatrogenic, the commonest thing being surgical wounds. If you go by the classification of the appearance, then we can have a tidy wound, incised, clean, there is no tissue loss, or it can be untidy wound. We can have crushed injuries, we can have avulsions with a flap, without a flap, we can have contaminated wounds because of foreign bodies. And these are the wounds which need to be managed well. And the whole aim is to make an untidy wound into a tidy wound and achieve healing, hopefully by primary intention. If we go by the time duration of wounds, then we can have acute wounds or we can have chronic wounds. Acute wounds are typically wounds that are less than 4 to 6 weeks in duration, and they heal by primary intention. Surgical wounds, incisions, stab wounds are typical examples of acute wounds. Now, when we come to chronic wounds, wounds that do not heal to up to 3 months are usually labeled as chronic wounds. The classic cases of what we see in our daily practice would probably be diabetic ulcers, or they could be pressure sores, or there can be wounds that are because of heavy bacterial contamination. Sometimes they can also classify wounds based on the thickness, and they can be superficial thickness, partial thickness. They're self-explanatory, where the epidermis is involved, dermis is involved. Full thickness can be where all entire dermis is involved, or there are deep wounds where there are vessels involved and other structures, and complicated wounds where we can have nerves, bone injury, or they can be penetrating, where they can be going on to the organs, like when you have an abdominal wounds. The whole aim in managing wounds probably would be to make a tidy wound into an untidy wound into a tidy wound. This can happen in acute injuries where there's no infection, and the primary suturing can happen, or it can go on to heal primarily. In an untidy wound, it's not possible to heal so well. So in that case, we probably have to excise or do debridement and then achieve primary suturing. Infected, lacerated wounds, wounds which are very large with heavy bacterial contamination, we may have to do some debridement, excise the wound, maybe some amount of normal tissue or abnormal tissue, and then these end up with delayed primary closure. Large, clean wounds probably can have good granulation tissue, and they can have skin drafting, and they can be ready for skin drafting, or they can be ready for flaps. Now, quickly going on to the factors that are affecting wound healing. As we all know, right from our undergraduate days and to our postgraduate days, there are local focal factors and there are general factors. Now, local factors can be depending upon the site that is involved. If it is in a place where it's going to have heavy motion or maybe across joints, then we do know that the wound will not get rest, and that the proliferation phase and the maturation phase, the phase 3, will not be coming into play very early, and it takes a longer time. If you have infection, then we know that the phase 1, that is the inflammatory phase, will be going on for a very longer time, and we need to take care of the bacteria that is involved and heal the wound. Also, if there's infection, we can take antibiotics. We can also pre-operatively, with our good clean surgical practices, take care of the skin that is there by scrubbing the wound, by depilatory methods, so that we do not have infection later. Foreign bodies can be exogenous or endogenous. Exogenous foreign bodies are there, which is there along with the wound when the wounds happen. Endogenous can be the form of maybe bones that are there or hair that are there. These are taken care of by the macrophages and the monocytes. And we do know that from the previous slides that the wound probably remains in a stage of inflammation, proliferation for a very longer period of time because of foreign body. Hematoma that is there, which will cause pressure within the wound, and which will delay the chemokines and the growth factors from entering into the wound and leading to healing. Structures that are involved can be blood vessels, which will come in the way. Pressure that is there, it could be because of the lower limb. For example, you can have diabetic foot, or we can have varicose veins, and the increased vascular pressure, even in the venous system, can give rise to decreased healing. Also, in a diabetic foot, because of hypoxia that is there in the vessels, will lead to decrease in collagen synthesis and decreased healing. Movement of the heels will come across, the scar is not formed very well, and it will not heal. If you have blood supply that is lost, hypoxia is a very potent, anything that is decreased the partial pressure of oxygen, if it is less than 40, then we do know that the collagen synthesis will not happen, because the hydration is not happening of the glycine and the proline that is there in the collagens, and that will interfere with the collagen synthesis. So we do know that diabetes, as well as diabetes, which leads to microangiopathy, as well as hypoxia, which is there because of atherosclerosis, will lead to decrease in collagen synthesis, and wound healing will occur. Age, we do know that quantitative as well as qualitative collagen is decreased as one advances. Comorbid condition in the form of diabetes, which also leads to microangiopathy or microstrain in the vessels, or maybe microstrains in the form of atherosclerosis. This leads to decreased collagen synthesis. Other generalized causes like malignancies, AIDS, or even malnourishment. Malnourishment can be malnutrition of vitamins, which is like A, C. C is very important for synthesis of collagen. Then vitamin K will be there. Vitamin zinc, which are micronutrients and minerals. This will come in the way of normal healing. These come because these also are responsible for the production of cofactors. Now, these cofactors will come in the way of your attracting your chemokines, which will come in the way of your attracting all your cell lines that will enter the wound. So indirectly, malnutrition in the form of vitamin A, C, E, or even micro minerals like zinc will eventually lead to a poor wound healing. Smoking will have an added effect. This also causes vasoconstriction. And sometimes smoking can also cause carbon monoxide, which replaces the normal oxygen. And this leads to decrease in the vascular endothelial growth factor and decrease in the angiogenesis. Sometimes medications like steroids, which will decrease the proliferation of metalloproteases, MMPs, which is very important for wound healing. And chemotherapeutic agents like doxorubicin, which will come in the way of wound healing. These decrease the metalloproteases that are there within the extracellular matrix, and these decrease the collagen in the sense, which will reach the area of injury, and that is the way the wound heals poorly. Now, just to quickly sum up about how to manage wounds. Any wound that is there, we have to take a proper history. We have to have a knowledge of what goes into the various. We have to know what goes into the various mechanisms of wound healing. We have to look at the wound and see what kind of wound are we looking at in terms of exudate. We can probably touch and see that the hypoxic wounds will be probably colder. Smell will be an obnoxious smell which will be coming, and we have the diagnosis by doing various investigations, and all these factors will probably help us in healing a wound a little better. The triangle of wound assessment was first propagated by Schulz or maybe Sebald in the year 2000. Before that, we were probably managing wounds in our very ancient way of maybe only saline dressings or maybe iodine-based dressings with various amount of gauze pieces and absorbent materials. But in 2000, with a seminal paper that was published by Sebald probably, and where he mentioned the triangle of wound assessment, where he talked about all these three elements, the wound bed, the wound edge, and the peri-wound skin. And that helped us in preparing the wound in a better way. And this is an internationally recognized framework which focuses on the wound bed, which identifies barriers to wound healing. It identifies interventions that are required to promote wound healing, and also advanced interventions in wounds that are not responding to routine treatment. All this is supposed to be leading to well-vascularized, a stable wound bed with minimum amount of exudate. And this probably will lead to a better wound bed preparation, a better granulation tissue, which can be probably taken care of by flaps or skin grafting or other methods of wound healing. Now, just very, very quickly, I think I want to just rush through this thing about the triangle of wound preparation. It encompasses wound edge, it encompasses wound end, wound bed, as well as peri-wound. Now, peri-wound skin, if we have an increased exudate, there are ways of managing it by having a better absorbent materials as dressing materials, so that we can have a healthy skin later. If you have excoriated or dry skin that is around the wound, then we do know that we can improve the skin management by giving Vaseline dressings or dressings which will increase the moisture capacity of the peri-wound area, and this can lead to healthy skin. And if you have a wound bed which has a lot of infection or a lot of inflammation, then we do know that this requires antimicrobial treatment, maybe in the form of systemic antibiotics, or sometimes we can try local antibiotics. Suppose the exudate is a higher level, then we need to manage the exudate in advanced management of dressings and take care of it. Otherwise, it will lead to maceration of the skin that is around it, and it will not be optimal wound bed. Suppose we have in the wound bed, we have non-viable tissue, then probably we do require to know debridement. Debridement to be caused. Now, debridement can be done by various methods. I will come to it later, which leads to a better granulation tissue. Just a small talk about biofilms, which is a complex structure of microorganisms contained in the extracellular matrix, which contains of proteins and polysaccharides, and these adhere to the surface and they cause a protective environment. And that is the reason why wounds do not heal well. This is a very classic biofilm that is seen in very routinely in our surgical practice. And we do know that because they are covered by this kind of a gel-like substance, they do not, antibiotics do not penetrate it, as well as there's no way of taking care of it. These are very stubborn to the stubbornly applied to the wound beds, and they require a very specific form of management in removing the biofilm and managing it. I also want to touch about the acronym that has been recognized recently, which is TIME, also called as TIME, which is probably published by Schulz, Sebald et al. In 2002 onwards, where they classified wounds as tissue that is non-viable or the tissue. Then we can have I as infection, the moisture imbalance, which is M, and edge of the wound. Probably the next slide will explain it in a better way. So if we have a tissue that is non-viable or defective, then we do know that we need to have debridement in various forms, chemical, mechanical, sharp, or autolytic. And we try and restore this kind of tissue that is non-viable by various methods to a viable skin base. Suppose we have infection and we have high bacterial counts. We do know that inflammatory cytokines and protease activity are on the higher side and the growth factor activity is on the lower side. So we need to remove this infective material and the foci, either by topical or by systemic antibiotic, and get back to the low bacterial counts and try and get a bacterial balance which has a reduced inflammation. Suppose we have moisture imbalance, that can be a dry wound or there can be an excessive wound or a cataric wound. If it is desiccated wound, then we can need to have moisture balancing dressings, which in the form of, which I will come to later, or we can have compression dressing or negative pressure dressings to remove the excess fluids so that we can restore epithelial migration, desiccation is avoided, and we can have a moisture balance. Now coming to lastly, the epidermal margins or the margin of the skin that is there, of the wound that is there. If you find that is non-advancing for whatever reason or they're undermined, then we do know that we have to find out the reason why it is undermining or not advancing. Maybe we need to take a tissue biopsy, rule out malignancy or a long-standing chronic infection, and then reassess the causes and do a course correction so that the migrating keratinocytes respond to the wound cells and they can restore it to the proper profile. And this is the way we can advance the epidermal margins of the edges. Nice. So I also want to talk very briefly. I know I'm running out of time probably. I just want to talk about the fact that the debridements, as you all know, can be carried out mechanically, chemically, or we can have biologic debridement in the bag of maggot therapy, or we can have the best available to us as surgeons are the sharp and surgical debridement, or we can have autolytic debridement. As we all know, skin is the best dressing, as told by Lister centuries ago. But in our times, we cannot apply skin always. So the characteristics of the ideal dressing which comes closest to the skin would be probably the ones that fulfill the criteria given ahead in the form of giving the best form of moist environment, in the form that it prevents desiccation, allows gaseous exchange, is impermeable to microorganisms, can be thermally insulating, should be non-toxic, non-traumatic, easy to use, and in our country, it should be cost-effective. The various, just very briefly touching upon the dressing materials that are available to us.
Madam, sorry, you exceeding a lot of time. The other speakers will not feel comfortable, you know.
Okay, I will just run through my slide.
If you, I think the other speakers would be discussing on the management anyway.
Okay, then I will probably just show the slides, probably the kind of wound materials, dressings that are available to us. And the exudates can be managed in various forms of dressings that are available to us. The commonest thing what we're using is NPWT in our institute. I just wanted to touch about the fact that acute wound healing, how it heals in a primary repair by the scar. This is a chronic wound which heals by sharp debridement and takes a longer time to heal, and heals by secondary intention, where we know that there is secondary suturing that is done, and that heals well. There are other modalities which I think the other speakers will touch upon. I'm sorry. So I need to just reiterate the fact that to heal a wound, we need to stop touching it very frequently. And that is what we need to learn right now by having better dressing materials and maybe do the wound change dressing every 4 to 5 days so that the epithelialization is not harmed by frequent dressing changes. I wish to acknowledge MSS for giving me an opportunity for this talk. I'm sorry I had to rush through it. I want to thank my patients from whom I've learned all this. I also want to thank my residents who have helped me prepare the slide and the PPT. Thank you so much. I want to thank Rajesh Yadav as well as Niranjan for reaching out to me for giving this talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, madam. So there is only one question.
Yes.
This is by Dr. Oh, just go.
Actually, you can ask the question.
Fine, I think. No, I think Dr. Kamath has asked about one question. Always you want to keep the wound dry. When you are using the vacuum dressing, so you are keeping an active dressing and you are keeping the wound dry. So is there any?
So probably there are methods, the extracellular matrix and the fluid that is there within the foam, because when you put NPWT, we have foam out there and then the wound that is there below it. And there are certain installation therapy. We have bioguanides which is there, which we can use to keep it a little moist, which will also help with the healing. So we can have insulation therapy along with NPWT to probably enhance or accelerate the wound healing.
Thank you, madam. There is no other question. I think you have given a lot of about everything. So yeah. So there is nobody to ask any more question.
So apologies to have stopped you in between. Apologies to have stopped you in between, but we had restrictions.
Fine,
After I would make you a request to speak into the laptop so that others can hear it very clearly.
Yes, sir. Yes.
Come closer to your laptop and then speak, and you can increase the volume to maximum.
In Dr. Kadam will introduce Dr. Aftab.
Hello, good evening, everybody. Sorry for joining a little late. Actually, there's some technical problems with my joining. Dr. Aftab is Associate Professor at the Department of General Surgery at Government Grand Medical College, Mumbai. He has to his credit about 25 national and state publications and 20 international publications. 16 years of post-MS experience teaching. Now over to Dr. Aftab.
Thank you, sir, for a kind introduction. It's a very good initiative by Mumbai Surgical Society. I thank Dr. Niranjan Agarwal, sir, and Dr. Rajesh Yadav for approaching me for lecture on arterial ulcer and its management. So, can you see my video screen, sir?
No. No, we are not able to see your screen. Only we can see you.
Now, sir?
Yeah, now it's starting. Yes.
So, as the first lecture was being very well covered by Dr. Smriti regarding the wound healing and its factors, one of the factors is the arterial blood supply.
Aftab, you'll have to increase your volume. Sorry, because there's this thing. People can't hear you.
Just a minute, sir.
I think if you
Can you hear me now, sir?
Yeah, better.
Yeah. As the lecture the first lecture was being very well covered by Dr. Smriti regarding the ulcers and its management. One of the focal cause was decreased blood supply. And that will be covered by me in short, because arterial ulcer as such is a huge topic to be covered in 30 minutes. To start with, arterial ulcers. As everybody knows, ulcer is a any break in the continuity of the covering epithelium or the mucous membrane associated with molecular death is defined in an ulcer. But in an arterial ulcer, where the peripheral arterial ulcer is associated with peripheral arterial disease, and it causes a poor peripheral circulation, and in that present, the ulcer will be an arterial ulcer. It can be a spontaneous ulcer, or it can be a post-traumatic ulcer. Usually, the peripheral artery disease is having a prevalence of around 14.5% in patients more than 69 years and about 20% in 80 years and older. This is a reference of Western area. Anyway, our country has a younger age group involved also due to the smoking habit and early atherosclerosis. The general causes of peripheral
artery. Please talk loudly. Sorry, please talk loudly, or you remove your earphone, your voice will be better.
Okay, sir.
Disconnect the earphone. Disconnect the earphone from the laptop.
Now it's okay, sir?
And slightly loud.
Yes, sir. Yes. In general, the causes for the peripheral artery disease are large vessel disease and small vessel disease. The large vessel disease are due to atherosclerosis, which is chronic and it is seen in older age, and embolism usually which is acute. And so small artery occlusion are usually seen in cases of Buerger's disease, seen in younger men between 20 to 40 years, Raynaud's phenomenon, Raynaud disease in younger females. Other causes are embolism, diabetes, scleroderma, and physical agents such as trauma, radiation, electrical burns, pressure necrosis, and cold, which is in which frostbites. Other causes such as large and small vessel vasculitis, such as giant cell arteritis, Takayusu's arteritis, polyarteritis nodosa, vaginal granulomatosis, Behçet's disease, are rare but still can be seen in our country, but more in the Western countries. The risk factors for the peripheral artery disease or the ulcers are diabetes, hypertension, hyperhomocystinemia, hyperlipidemia. Smoking is the commonest cause of peripheral artery disease, in which Buerger's disease is seen, and the intensity is all strongly associated with the smoking, and it is attributable fraction at around 44%. Renal insufficiency, male gender, and black race also contributes as a risk factor. Now, etiopathogenesis of the atherosclerosis, as everybody knows, everybody has been taught in MBBS days and MS days regarding the atherosclerosis. Whenever there an tunica intima is injured, after injuring the tunica intima is injured, the endothelial lining is having local inflammation. There is having increased permeability. Leukocyte adhesion and monocyte adhesion can be seen, with smooth muscle immigration from media into the intima, and macrophage activation is seen. Along with that, smooth cells and macrophages both engulf lipid and they form atheroma in the intima. Other etiopathogenesis of other causes are Buerger's disease. As everybody knows, thromboangiitis obliterans is the other name for Buerger's disease, seen in young men between 20 to 40 years of age. These are usually smokers, and it is defined as inflammation of arteries with accompanying veins and nerves. It is usually seen in the medium-sized vessel. It's a segmental involvement with the collateral formation. Raynaud's disease, seen in younger women. Upper limb is most commonly involved than the lower limb. Raynaud's phenomenon very much in the Raynaud's disease, which is characterized by local syncope, local asphyxia, and local recovery. Syncope characterized by white limb, asphyxia by blue, and local recovery by red color. So it can be in the mnemonic can go by WBC, white, blue, and crimson. Clinical features of in which the symptoms in commonly patient of peripheral artery disease with ulcers are seen with previous history of intermittent claudication or with prevalence of intermittent claudication, usually seen in leg ulcers of 19% of population with leg ulcers. How do you define intermittent claudication? It is crampy pain in the lower limbs, and it aggravates on exercise or movement, which relieves on rest to start with, and it is due to accumulation of substance P. Usually the claudication is seen in the legs in the block below femoropopliteal junction, and if the aortofemoral block is there, associated claudication can be seen in buttocks and thighs. One more entity called as critical limb ischemia, where it is defined as persistent ischemic rest pain lasting for more than 2 weeks in spite of continuous analgesia, associated with ulceration of limb, associated with an ankle systolic pressure less than 50 or toe systolic pressure less than 30. Critical limb ischemia is a marker or on which it depends upon the to note the severity of the ischemia of the limb. According to that, we can choose the type of management or the various methods of treatment given to the patient. Boyd's classification of intermittent claudication, grade 1, in which patient walks till the claudication distance he experiences pain, and then patient is relieved on further walking due to washout of substance P from the muscle. Patient in grade 2, patient walks for a distance, develops pain, can walk with effort, and patient in grade 3, patient walks for a distance, but patient is compelled to take rest in grade 3. You should always there is always difference between grade 3 and rest pain. Rest pain in which patient has pain during rest, that is due to the cry of dying nerves, and it should not be confused with grade 3 of the Boyd's classification. Now you can see the ulcers usually at the terminal, the distal part of the foot, usually on the pre-tibial aspect, and when there is complete blockage of the artery, we can see Basqui's discoloration of toes or limb, and that is nothing but gangrene. What are the features of an arterial ulcers? Ischemic ulcers are usually painful. It has irregular edges if it is an acute ulcer. Punched out ulcer, as we see in a syphilitic ulcer, punched out appearance is seen because of the destruction of deep fascia, as it is characteristic of end arteritis. Location is usually, as discussed, it can be dorsum of foot or toes and pre-tibial. Base of the ulcer usually is poorly developed grayish glacial tissue, which is not typical characteristic of an ischemic ulcer. It has to be differentiated from other ulcers. Tendons, bones, or underlying joints can also be exposed with minimal granulation tissue. On examination, the signs of ischemia can be as pre-gangrenous changes of any limb can be seen as the thinning of the skin, diminished growth of hair, loss of subcutaneous fat, shininess. Nails are usually brittle and shows transverse ridges. There are minor ulcerations in the pressure area such as heel, malleoli, ball of great toes, tips or toes, etc. Sometimes we can even see skip lesions in the lower limb proximal to the ulcers or gangrene to note the level of block. Gangrene of the extremities can be dry or wet. In dry, due to chronic ischemia, usually it is shriveled, mummified appearance. The line of demarcation is present and is in wet, usually due to arterial as well as venous blockage. The superadded infection and edematous limb is associated with inflammation. There is pus discharge as well as foul smelling pus discharge with line of demarcation is not that well defined. This on the left side is the image of arterial ulcer just now, which is a fresh debridement with exposed tendons and bones. On the left side, sorry, on the right side, there is a third toe amputated, the foot with third toe amputated base seen with unhealthy granulation tissue, and the second toe has a gangrene, dry gangrene. Examination of pulses is a must. We should know to know the level of block, and it is easier for the diagnosis at what level the block is there, and as per that you can correlate with the history as per the history and level of block. All peripheral pulses should be from head to toe. It should be compared in upper and lower limbs, and intensity should be compared. Dorsalis pedis, if it is absent, may be absent in about 10% of patients. Vessel wall should be palpated well to know the atherosclerosis or calcification. Other tests, special tests of the peripheral artery disease such as Allen's test, Addison's test, capillary refilling time, and hyperadduction maneuver should be done in upper limb, and in lower limb, Burgess postular test, capillary refilling time, and crossed legs test or Fuchsic's test for the examination of popliteal artery should be done. In neurological examination, we should always see for the sensory loss by Simmons-Winston monofilament test, which we examine with the filament at the 4 points at the sole and compare with the non-affected limb. Palpation of abdomen, femoral, and popliteal regions should be done to rule out any aneurysms. Auscultation is, or no examination is over unless we auscultate the vessels to rule out aneurysms and AV malformations. Other classification of the critical limb ischemia has a classification named after Lerici-Fontaine classification, in which stage 1 is usually asymptomatic, in which clinically there are no any signs to, and stage 2 is divided into A and B. In A, there is patient has pain, which patient has the walking distance of more than 200 meters. There is relative hypoxia, and in stage 2B, patient can walk, but the claudication distance less than 200 meters. In stage 3 and 4, there is unstable, invalidant claudication is present. In 3A, rest pain is there with hypoxia of skin and tissue acidosis and ischemic neuritis. In stage 3B, rest pain along with ankle pressure is less than 50 millimeter of mercury. Stage 4 is frank gangrene or necrosis. How to diagnose an arterial disease or an ulcer associated with peripheral artery disease? You should have a detailed examination and history, routine blood investigations, along with all routine blood investigation. Lipid profile is a must, of which should be very well studied to know whether patient has hypercholesterolemia, and that should be managed well. Duplex scanning, in which it is a combination of with the Doppler study, which gives an anatomy of the vessel as well. It gives the level of block, type of flow, whether it's monophasic or triphasic, subcutaneous collection around the ulcers, and then we can go ahead along as per the level of the block and the types of design, what modality the patient needs the surgery, or it can be managed by conservative management. Along as per that, angiography can be advice. Either it can be digital subtraction angiography, magnetic resonance angiography, or CT angiography. Before that, ankle pressure index is an important landmark to know whether the patient has severe ischemia, or it can be managed if severe or it's a mild ischemia. Normally, ankle brachial index in the ratio of ankle systolic pressure by brachial systolic pressure. Now it is normal 0.9 to 1.4 is normal range, and it is 75 to 95% sensitive, and specificity is also 95%. If it is less than 0.3, the limb patient has a critical limb ischemia. 0.4, if patient has a critical limb ischemia along with ankle systolic pressure less than 50 and systolic toe pressure less than 30, or otherwise transcutaneous partial pressure of oxygen should be less than 30, then you can label the patient as a critical limb threatening ischemia. In the protocol of planning of intervention of any patient having peripheral artery disease, imaging for the imaging, we should first go for a duplex ultrasound, and MRA, magnetic resonance angiography, or CT angiography depends upon what levels of vessels has to be visualized. In usually magnetic resonance angiography is used for the TPL and foot vessels, and CT angiography for major vessels if aorta and suprapopliteal arteries. After the detailed study of duplex and angiographies, we should how to manage a patient of peripheral artery disease. Primary management should be prevention of the risk factors, such as early diagnosis and treatment of comorbidities such as diabetes, hypertension, lifestyle changes such as walking or exercise, weight reduction, dietary modification, in which diet for hypertension and diabetic diet should be given to control the diabetes, and smoking. Cessation of smoking is the most important thing that has to be executed in the patient with a chronic smoker. In medical management, antihypertensives and oral hypoglycemics with insulin to maintain HbA1c less than 7% should be the first aim. Antiplatelet agents such as clopidogrel or aspirin should be given to inhibit thromboxane A2 synthesis, which prevents platelet aggregation. Statins such as rosuvastatin, atorvastatin should be given to reduce the lipid level. phosphodiesterase inhibitors, pentoxifylline, which improves the RBC's pliability, and that increases the capillary blood flow, and which is being used since years. Cilostazol is a newer phosphodiesterase 3 inhibitor which prevents platelet aggregation and promotes vasodilatation. Xanthanol nicotinate has a very tricky role in which enhances the blood flow to periphery and the cerebral tissues. It decreases platelet aggregation and increases erythrocyte elasticity, which improves blood flow. It has also a vasodilatory effect. Xanthanol, which is a positive charged ion which carries the nicotinic acid, it helps in transport of nicotinic acid, which acts as a coenzyme for the synthesis of proteins and tissue synthesis of protein, which is involved in tissue respiration. It also augments the glucose and oxygen utilization in the cells. It checks the serum lipids and fibrinogen levels. Then what is the surgical management in wound and limb management overall, along with the ulcer management? It can be local surgical debridement, amputation if it is a frank gangrene, whether it can be a small digital amputation or a whole limb amputation. Depends upon the level of block. Revascularization of the limb for chronic non-healing ulcers, omentopexy, which was done as an age-old technique, but nowadays still it's good in expert hands. Now more of obsolete procedure. Endovascular techniques and open bypass surgery. What is SVS Wi-Fi score? SVS is nothing but the Society for Vascular Surgery. It involves wound. Wi-Fi is W is wound, I is in ischemia, FI is foot infection. So definitive management of the limb depends upon the Wi-Fi score. It's a new classification which is intended to stratify the amputation risk and impact clinical management based on 3 major factors, that is wound, ischemia, and foot infection. It has a prognostic value and prediction of amputation risk. Wound is again classified into 4, 0, 1, 2, 3. 0 is no ulcer or no gangrenes. 1 is small ulcer. 2 is deep ulcer or gangrene limited to only toes. 3 is extensive ulcer and extensive gangrene. I is ischemia, toe pressure more than 60 is 0. 1 is 40 to 59. 2 is 30 to 39. 3 is less than 30. Foot infection is 0 is uninfected. 1 is mild. 2 is moderate, and 3 is severe or SIRS. Now, if you go in details of the wound classification, it depends for the rest pain and wound or tissue loss. As discussed, 0 is no ulcer. There is ischemic rest pain, although 1 is small shallow ulcers, only up to the skin of subcutaneous tissue, no exposed bone. There is no gangrene in 1 or 2. There is deeper ulcers up to the bone or joint or tendon, not involving the heel. And clinical description has major tissue loss, which is still salvageable with multiple or less than 3 digital amputations. Gangrenous changes are there, only limited to the digits. 3 is extensive deep ulcer involving 4 foot or mid-foot and full thickness heel or calcaneal involvement. In this, extensive loss is there, salvageable only with complex foot reconstructions or transmetatarsal amputations. It has extensive gangrene involving 4 foot and mid-foot. In ischemia, again, it is divided into 4, 0, 1, 2, 3, depending upon the toe pressure. Along with that, ankle brachial index is also graded as 0 as more than 0.8, 1 is 0.6 to 0.7, 2 is 0.4 to 0.5, and 3 is less than. Foot infection is divided dependent upon the, it has adaptation. SVS foot infection is adaptation disease of Society of America or International Working Group on Diabetic. Depends upon perfusion, extent or size of the ulcer or infection, depth and tissue loss, infection, and sensation. Nothing but it's a mnemonic, or it can be called as PEDIS classification. So perfusion has again divided into 3 as no peripheral artery disease, peripheral artery disease present, critical limb issue. Extent is intact, less than 1 is intact, and or it is up to the bone. Infection, no infection or surface or only abscess involvement or it is a systemic inflammation infection. All, if you go in deep, this is the final severity infection where we can classify 0, 1, 2, 3, in which the PEDIS classification 0 is uninfected, 1 is mild, as discussed only skin and subcutaneous involved, moderate is 2, where local infection is erythema is more than 2 centimeter. Skin and subcutaneous tissue is involved. Along with that, abscess is present, sometimes osteomyelitis and fasciitis. No SIRS response is seen. In 3, it is SIRS response or fever and tachycardia and filter rate is more. This is the final interpretation of Wi-Fi classification, where all the points of ischemia, wound infection, and foot infection is laid down, and H is nothing but high ischemia, H is moderate, high risk, M is moderate risk, L is low risk, and VL is very low risk.
Aftab, just a second. Yeah, Aftab.
Yes.
Kuldeep, can you mute the others because there's some disturbances in the back? Kuldeep?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. I will
mute the others. Yeah, mute all the others except the speaker.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Now, after the evaluation of the patient and further management of the critical limb threatening ischemia, when the patient is being suspected having this, needs to be evaluated by knowing if patient has rest pain and after physical examination suggestive of peripheral artery disease, and measurement of the ankle pressure index as well as Doppler waveforms. If it is normal, we have to know whether there is a tissue loss or gangrene. If no, then search for other causes of rest pain. If there is abnormal ABI less than 0.9, then to measure the toe pressure and Doppler waveforms. According to that, the limb severity has to be staged and then obtain a vascular pattern. For the management of critical limb threatening of ischemia, you have to stage the severity of the limb by Wi-Fi classification. In low limb risk, that is Wi-Fi stage 1, the wound care and surveillance of the deterioration and management only by the medical care would be more than enough. In the patients having stage Wi-Fi stage 2, where the patient the limb can be salvaged, the patient 2-year risk survival has to be considered, where revascularization procedures either by endovascular techniques in high risk patient or standard risk technique, where the patient can be managed by bypass surgeries, either autologous or stent, should be evaluated. In the surgeries, endovascular therapy or open surgery, it has to be weighted as per the patient's risk factors, such as in endovascular therapy, where the patient has wounds and open amputations to promote healing, but in such patients may not require further procedure after wound healing. Proximal or large vessels disease with shorter life expectancies of the patients, and patient having severe medical comorbidities which cannot be given general anesthesia, such because of COPD or chronic coronary artery disease. Open surgery should be done in the patients with a limited tibial runoff. Now, what is a runoff? In which the patient has a distal adequate collaterals, but in a limited tibial runoff, patient has to go for open surgery, open bypass surgery, or any open endarterectomy. Distal vessels with long segment and multi-level disease, and claudication which disables the patient with daily activities. In these, we have to go for the open surgery. In endovascular therapy, is usually it was limited initially for focal lesions, but nowadays because of vast and interventional radiology with good expertise, it is used for long segment lesions in tibial as well as pedal vessels. The procedures usually angioplasty, atherectomy, embolectomy, or primary stenting can be done. This is
you'll have to wind up after.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. This is a small video where we can see a anterior-tibial blockage with a non-healing ulcer on the foot, where patient the atherosclerosis is blocking the distal vessel, so that has to be dilated by a balloon angioplasty, and stent is deployed. in other procedures such as thrombectomy or in catheter aspiration thrombectomy can be done, as well as mechanical thrombectomy can be done by thrombolysis. Just skip these videos. In open surgeries, bypass grafting by bifemoral bypass by prosthetic bifurcated conduits can be done, in which usually before bypass grafting we should pre-evaluate the other by duplex ultrasound the caliber and quality of autologous veins, either on the same side on the other side, and detailed assessment should be done of the distal target artery. And usually autologous vein conduits such as ipsilateral, contralateral, great saphenous vein, small saphenous vein, femoral vein, or basilic vein should be evaluated. Prosthetic conduits can also be used. These are the newer conduits made of Dacron, PTFE, and human umbilical vein, which are the newer in the markets. Autologous vein are usually outperforms over the other conduits in infrainguinal bypass. These are the various types of grafts. This is a pictorial depiction of bifemoral aortobifemoral bypass. This is a femoral-popliteal bypass by an autologous saphenous vein. Omentopexy, as I just told, it was a routine procedure done before by an expertise in patients with SVS grade 1 and 2. Patient selection is the patient selection should be good, otherwise results would be not bad. Patient usually land up in amputation post omentopexy. Nowadays it's an absolute procedure. Post surgery, the surveillance should be by Doppler ultrasound for the first month, and in patients with recurrent wounds or symptoms after the first month, every 3 months we should do a Doppler ultrasound to maintain to note the efficacy of the procedure. Thank you, sir. Thank you for giving me an opportunity, and I thank my Department of Surgery from JJ Hospital. I thank my students, Dr. Amarjeet and Dr. Sachin Solapur, for their inputs in the making of this PowerPoint.
Any questions for Dr. Aftab, chairpersons?
I wanted to ask him, Niranjan, he did not mention anything about the sympathectomy that is done, maybe chemical or open surgical, just to increase the caliber of the small vessels, which was propagated probably 20 years ago, either chemical sympathectomy or surgical.
Yeah. Chemical sympathectomy still, I think so, it has a role in a patient of rest pain. Usually when we were residents, we used to do a lumbar sympathectomy, open or laparoscopic, still done by some experts, but chemical sympathectomy can even be done in a patient where patient has superficial rest pain.
Thank you.
If there are no further questions, then I would like to take this opportunity to welcome Dr. Abhay Dalvi, who is the President of the Association of Surgeons of India. He is logged in, and we're very thankful to you, sir. Welcome. Would you like to say a few words, sir? Dr. Dalvi?
No, I am enjoying and learning. I missed out on Smriti's, but I will see it, the recorded version, because I was busy with some other Zoom where I was supposed to talk. So please go ahead. You are doing a wonderful job.
Thank you, sir. At the end, you can teach her after all the sessions are over. Chairperson, please introduce the third speaker.
The third person is Dr. Milind Wagh. Dr. Milind Wagh, you're welcome. Dr. Milind Wagh is MCH in plastic surgery from Sion Hospital. Worked as a dedicated reconstructive hand and microsurgeon for 15 years. He is a research fellow at O'Brien Institute of Microsurgery, Melbourne, Australia. He moved to aesthetic surgery and core interest in body contouring, surgical facial rejuvenation, and aesthetic breast surgery for last 15 years. Presently Vice President, Local Association of Aesthetic Plastic Surgeons in Mumbai. He is a member of India of the Global Education Council, International Society of Aesthetic Plastic Surgeons, Ethicon Professor of Cosmetic Surgery, Deputy Editor of the Indian Journal of Plastic Surgery for last 8 years. Now he's attached to various corporate hospitals Yes, sir. Welcome, and please start your lecture.
Thank you, Dr. Kadam. Thank you, Dr. Machuel, and thanks to Dr. Niranjan Agarwal for the last 30 years. Thanks, Niranjan, for inviting me to speak on this occasion. I'd like to share my screen now. Can you see my screen?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Right. So my brief today is to speak on management of acute wounds. It's a vast topic, but I'll try my best to cover it in the 30 minutes that I have. Disclaimer is that, of course, I have no financial interest in any of the commercial products that I may mention in my presentation. What is an acute wound? Well, it's a fresh or a recent wound which has yet to progress through any of the body's sequential stages of wound healing. As a plastic surgeon, I feel that more and more patients now insist on having a plastic surgeon to take care of their acute wounds, even minor wounds, because they are concerned about the final appearance of the healed scar. But on the other hand, most of them don't want any scar at all. And they believe that plastic surgeons can do magic, which is a little bit of a worry for us. Let's go straight away into the type of acute wounds. And the ones that I'm going to cover are the ones which are mentioned in blue here, although you have the list written for the entire type of acute wounds. I'm going to cover CLWs, wounds with tissue loss, degloving injuries, and crush injuries. And I will just talk a little bit in one slide about amputations because that's very dear to my heart. Dr. Aftab talked about preventing amputations. I'm talking about amputations that have already occurred and that need to be replanted. Now, the classification of acute wounds can also be done in this manner, depending on the status of the wound. A clean wound, a clean contaminated wound, a contaminated wound, or a dirty wound. And obviously, the type of wounds have been mentioned there. A surgical wound is clean. Everything else, including traumatic wounds, are at least clean, contaminated, potentially. And the dirty wounds are those which are devitalized, they have debris, they have potential infection, etc., etc. How do we now assess acute wounds? Obviously, the first thing to do is to take a history from the patient about the etiology of the wound. How did the wound occur? What was the mechanism of injury? Was it self-inflicted? Was it the glass? Was it in a machine, etc., etc.? Then we will always ask about comorbidities, which means things like diabetes, hypertension, ischemic heart disease, any asthma, etc. Any allergies, and of course, any medications that the patient is on. Now, this is important because there are certain medications that cause increased bleeding. We are quite aware of those medications like blood thinners, but there are several other medications that we know as plastic surgeons, including things like green tea, ginkgo biloba, ginger, garlic pearls, which the patient takes, including Ayurvedic medications. A lot of them contain steroids, and they can cause a lot of bleeding during and after surgery. Of course, we have to also ask about the tetanus immunization status. I will come to this a little later, although you might think that this is something that is old hat, but it's not. Once you experience a patient who has had a problem, you know that you need to talk more about it. Going on to clinical examination, we are all surgeons here, so this is just a revision for us. We need to look at the wound edges. We need to see the wound length, width, and depth. We need to see if there's any tissue loss, whether there's any injury to any deeper structures, meaning vital structures, which vital structures we'll talk about, whether there is any presence of foreign bodies, any contamination, or any debris. Is there any acute bleeding, active bleeding in the wound, and what is the local vascularity following the injury? Then we will also want to see the functional loss in a distal neurological status, because that's important. And examination is the time to do this because especially in the extremities where, extending and flexing the wrist, the fingers, the thumb will tell you whether there is a possibility of any deeper injury to the tendon. Similarly, looking at sensations, looking at the small muscles of the hand moving will also tell you whether there is any neurological problem. And of course, we have to always look for fractures. Now, this is important, I think, in the present scenario. We are now in 2021, no longer in the 19th century. So pain relief and early pain relief is, I think, something very important from the patient's point of view. So in children, so that they can facilitate and help us to examine them, oral medications are available, which are well known to our anesthetists and even in the casualty department, which can be given to children, which do not cause any problems with fasting. And of course, some local anesthesia can always be infiltrated or instilled into the wound. You will find that if you add a little bit of soda bicarb to xylocaine, the injection is not painful at all. And the patient will tolerate the injection very well and then allow you to examine the wound quite nicely. And of course, I want to mention regional blocks because there's this one exceptional hospital in India called the Ganga Hospital in Coimbatore, where the protocol is, it's a world-class hospital, probably one of the very few world-class plastic surgery hospitals in India, where the protocol is as soon as the patient comes, the patient gets given a sensory nerve block. A regional block is given, so the patient is pain-free, and then he allows you to examine him, and the patient being pain-free takes care of a lot of other factors as related to management. Now, about the assessment of acute wounds, investigation that we need, very, very simple. X-rays are the preliminary investigation, and only if you need, would you do an ultrasound, a CT scan, or an MRI. And that's, of course, depending on what your clinical examination tells you. It's very important to understand that missing deeper injuries to vital structures is a part and parcel of examining acute wounds. For example, look at this gentleman who had a small cut on his finger from a glass piece. And I was told by the junior medical officer in a particular corporate hospital that, no, doctor, there's no problem. I'm just going to suture the wound. But the patient himself said, doctor, I'm unable to extend my index finger. Fortunately, we were able to get an ultrasound done from a good ultrasoundologist, and you can see that there is a gap in the EIP here at the level of the where the wound is. And therefore, we were able to go and open the wound a little bit, explore, and suture the extensor indicis proprius. Two more cases here. These are both self-inflicted wounds in the tendons, self-inflicted wounds on the forearm. And when we explored the wounds, we found multiple cut tendons. And in the slide on the right-hand side, you can see that there is a severed median nerve. One more case where this is a slash injury done with a sword to the face of this young boy. And you can see that the parotid duct has been divided. You can see that there is a thread of proline in the two ends of the parotid duct. And then the last slide on the right-hand side shows you that the parotid duct has been sutured. So it's, in summary, really, it is very, very important to explore and see the wound to assess the deeper structures. Now, tetanus prophylaxis in 2021, you might find old hat, but let me tell you something, that I had a patient who was 45 years old, who had a very innocuous wound on his forearm. The wound was sutured. I made a very cursory questioning about his tetanus status. And he said, doctor, yeah, at some point in time, doctor, I've had it. And then about 12 hours later, I was called by the RMO of that particular hospital saying that the patient has come back to casualty and it looks like he's showing signs of tetanus. Later on further questioning, it turned out that the patient had had only one dose of tetanus immunization when the patient was 7 years old. And remember, now he was 45. Of course, this needed to be then referred to a physician and he did whatever was necessary, antibiotics, tetanus, antiglobulin and all that. So it is important even now in 2021 to do tetanus prophylaxis. You see one case and then you are a child that dreads the fire. Let's talk about repair and healing of acute wounds in a timeline. Now, the gold standard is primary repair, that is repair by primary intention. Sometimes you may need to do delayed primary repair, which is usually anytime after 24 hours to up to 7 days, at least in the plastic surgery parlance. And secondary repair is any repair that is done after 7 days, up to 6 weeks. There is a fourth categorization that we do as plastic surgeons, which is called delayed secondary. We don't call it tertiary repair, which is up to 3 months. And of course, we have healing by secondary intention, which basically means that the wound is being allowed to contract and cicatrize. Now, here's our famous reconstructive ladder. And as you ascend the rungs of the ladder, you go from simple to complex. We are all aware of this. So I will not really read out the rungs of the ladder. What about anesthesia? Now, anesthesia for management of acute wounds, I said that earlier. You can give local anesthesia in the form of infiltration. It can also be a little bit of instillation before the surgery is done and after the surgery is done. We can have regional blocks, especially for extremities. And of course, there is general anesthesia, either in the form of a laryngeal mask airway or an endotracheal intubation. Now, children usually don't allow you to do suturing under local anesthesia. It's an exceptional child who will allow you suturing under local anesthesia. So general anesthesia is preferred. And of course, there are patients with comorbidities and those patients whose general condition may not be suitable for general anesthesia. And therefore, you may have to do it under local. Let's talk about CLW. We already talked about anesthesia. Especially in extremities, the use of a tourniquet is very, very important. Now, the tourniquet does exsanguinate. Now, the question that naturally gets asked, if the tourniquet gets exsanguinates, then how will you see the bleeding? This is not really true because dermal bleeding still takes place. So it's absolutely fine to use a tourniquet in the extremities because it helps you to have a nice bloodless field when you're doing the surgery. Of course, the tourniquet may need to be released at some point to absolutely ensure that we have good, fine, healthy bleeding edges. The next most important step is a very thorough lavage, which is usually done with normal saline. In most cases, a 20 or a 50 cc syringe on an 18 number needle with a hub broken off is enough to give a very nice lavage with maybe about 500 to 600 cc of normal saline. And it's quite rare in a really large and extensive wound, maybe degloving, a lot of contamination, foreign bodies, debris, where you require a pulse lavage system. The next step, of course, is the evacuation of all clots and hematoma, and then obviously looking at hemostasis. So you may use, you may just use pressure for some time, or you may just, catch some vessel and then cauterize it, or you may tie it off. Of course, usually the situation does not come when we go past all that and we turn to prayer. The next part is, of course, the removal of all contaminants and foreign bodies and making sure that the wound is clear of all that. The most vital part before we begin suturing is freshening of the contused edges and assessment of dermal bleeding from the edges. And you can see in this photograph here on the right-hand side that that edge is contused, and therefore it must be freshened before any repair is done. Before we start suturing the wound in layers, of course, this is what we mentioned earlier. We must see if there are any fractures, any muscle tendon injuries, any vascular or nerve injuries, and tackle them depending on what injury appears to be there. Coming down to suturing in layers, the 3 or 4 most important principles is gentle apposition of tissue and therefore a tension-free closure. Absolutely no dead space, which is why suturing in layers. No undermining, and there are double stars there. In one more slide, I will explain what I mean. And of course, if a wound is very deep, then drainage, either in the form of a corrugated drain or a suction drain, depending on what size you like, or a Omovite drain or a mini vac or something like that, if necessary. And I'll tell you something, post-operative instillation of local anesthesia, we usually use 0.25% or 2.5% bupivacaine or ropivacaine. And just instilling at the end of suturing gives complete pain relief without the necessity for anything further for at least 6 to 8 hours. Now, we talked about layers. So different parts of the body, what are the layers that we usually suture? In the scalp, it's a single layer. We all know that. We know that. In the face, it's the SMAS layer, the subcutaneous layer, and then the skin. In the torso, by which I mean the chest and the abdomen, it's muscle, fascia, subcutaneous skin. I'm not talking about perforating or penetrating injuries here. And in the extremities, the most important thing to remember is that never suture the deep fascia. To the extent, because the deep fascia is inextensible. So I would want to repeat this once again, never suture the deep fascia to the extent that actually take a cut in the deep fascia in the axis of the limb, so that you open the deep fascia out, because compartment syndromes can occur very quickly in a cylindrical limb, and it's known to happen. Why no undermining? We talked about that just a little while ago. Right? Well, it decreases vascularity. It opens up fresh uninjured planes, and you simply don't want to do that unless it is absolutely necessary. It creates a pocket. Like I said, uninjured planes are open for the collection of clots, a seroma, or potential infection. And because you've done undermining. Why do you do undermining? You do undermining because the edges will not come together gently. And the moment you do that, it means that when you take stitches, however careful you are, you will obviously take tight stitches, and sutures will strangulate the tissues to some extent, for sure. Now, if at all limited undermining is to be done, it is best done in the suprafacial plane, not in the subcutaneous plane. Now, in the ideal world, it should be done in from the vascularity point of view, it needs to be done in the subfacial plane. But that doesn't make any sense, because the subfacial plane, remember I said, is inextensible. So that doesn't make any difference as far as moving the tissues together is concerned. So do it in the suprafacial plane, and in different planes, in different parts of the body, this plane for limited undermining is different. Now, methods of closure of wound, we really don't need to talk too much about this. There are sutures of different types, interrupted, continuous, combination of both. There may be staples, there may be steri-strips, and there may be skin glue. This is one slide that I want to talk about. We have what are called relaxed skin tension lines. They have been shown here in the face and in the rest of the body. Now, plastic surgeons are always told to orient their scars along relaxed skin tension lines, because minimum scarring occurs as long as the wound is parallel to these RSTLs. But of course, when wounds occur, they don't ask ki aisa hu ya vaisa hu. So the important thing to remember is that as far as possible, do not go out of your way to orient along the RSTLs. There is always room for a scar revision later on if the wound does not settle satisfactorily, or rather the scar does not settle satisfactorily. Methods of suturing, very quickly, interrupted simple suturing. We all know about that. We know what vertical mattress is. We know what is continuous over and over. And we also know what is continuous locking. One combination is where you do a continuous, but you interrupt it, bring the knot out, take a knot, and then continue once more. especially over a long wound. What this helps to do is that in case there is any collection, any seroma, any purulent discharge, you can just remove that segment of the wound and you don't, the rest of the suturing does not unravel. And of course, some more. This is what is called the 3-point suture, where you go in from one edge, you collect the lower part of the dermis, either vertically or horizontally in the other edge, and then you come back to the same edge and get the edges together. It gives a very nice apposition of the dermis and the epidermis. And of course, the well-known subcuticular suture, we can use either an absorbable or a non-absorbable, and then either it can not be knotted internally at both edges of the wound or both margins of the wound, or we start proximal to the wound itself, come into the wound, go across the wound, come out beyond the wound and just leave the suture long. Common suture materials, again, no rocket science here. Catgut is no longer available in India, but we have Vicryl, we have Monocryl, and we have PDS. Non-absorbable linen is really historical. Silk is slowly becoming historical, so we are now left with Prolene and Ethilon as the common suture materials. The recommendations as a plastic surgeon for closure of wound are tabled in these two tables here. For the scalp, if you're doing a single layer suture, you would like to use Ethilon or Prolene, 30 or 40. If you're doing it in an area where there's no hair, I'm not talking about the forehead or the temporal area, that's not part of the scalp. I'm talking about in a balding patient, then you would like to use 40 Vicryl or PDS in the subcutaneous plane, and then use 50 or Ethilon or Prolene in the for the skin. For the face, we talked about the layers, and you can see what the suture material ideally should be. For the torso, meaning the chest and the abdomen, that's what it is here. The fascia in the torso can be sutured, but in the extremities, it should not be. Now, basic dressings. Well, there is a plethora of dressings available in the market, but starting from probably the last century. But even in 2021, the basic dressing is still the best dressing. What was taught to us in MBBS, in internship, in MS is still the best dressing. So a layer of antiseptic ointment and cream can be water-based or oil-based, covered by a layer of either Cuticel or Bactigras, which is a non-adherent dressing. Then put a moist gauze, because for the first 48 hours, you require a little bit of moisture in the wound. As the wound starts to heal, you can use moist gauze or moist Gamgee pad. Then a layer of dry gauze, because the tape will not stick to the moist gauze. Then you use an hypoallergenic tape and give mild compression. The compression does two things. It tries to obliterate whatever little dead space you've left. It also helps in controlling the edema, and it also helps as far as inflammation is concerned to some extent. At the end of 48 hours, you change the dressing, decrease the layers, and of course, you don't need the compression anymore. What about open care? Well, it is now very well known that clean contaminated wounds, which are sutured well in layers, they seal off in about 24 to 48 hours time. So without sounding very crude, even if you spit on that wound, it does not really matter. It's really sealed off. But the first look at 48 hours is what you need to do. You assess the edge vascularity, you see whether there's any inflammation, see whether there's any seroma or any potential purulent discharge, and you assess the edema. If all the signs appear good, then if the patient is not apprehensive, the suture line can be kept open with a thin layer of ointment or cream, which the patient is told to apply 1 to 2 times a day. Just make sure that the patient understands that he doesn't apply layer on layer. For second time he applies it, whatever is applied the first time needs to be cleaned off with just some wet gauze or with maybe a Johnson a tip. This 48 hours is the time to open sutures. This is your best time to open sutures, release seromas and express purulent discharge, and you can still get away with having primary wound closure. If you delay it later, then I think most of the time you miss the bus. And if the patient is not apprehensive, the patient can be asked to take a bath after 48 hours. So now quickly going through cases, this is just a superficial CLW on the cheek, simple interrupted sutures. You can see that's the appearance at the end of 4 weeks. And going on to a CLW on the eyebrow, we have taken continuous over and over sutures, opposing the edges quite nicely. And here's a patient with a CLW of the nose with a wound over the eyelid. And I would like you to concentrate on this particular photograph. You can see here that the edge of this is very thin. Yeah, and there's already a compromise in vascularity. So if you suture it back just like that, you're going to have a problem with healing and you're going to have a terrible scar. But if you excise this, which is freshening of the edges, and then you suture it, that's the kind of scar you can expect at the end of approximately 6 to 8 weeks. Another patient, a further degloving CLW on the nose, you can see that there is a deep CLW going vertically, but this flap is almost completely come out on 3 sides. And in fact, if you look at it, this is the only area which is vascular. Now this can be put back. You don't need to remove it out. this can be put back because this can still serve as a biological dressing. Now, the important part here is that this is fairly thick. So this has been sutured like normal, but this is very thin. So if you see here, what I've taken are what are called twists, which means that there's one single double throw just to hold the thing in place. And if it stays like that, good enough. Otherwise, it just serves as a biological dressing. And this is the result at 3 weeks post-op, and the one on the right-hand side, you can see is at 3 months post-op. So the entire flap survived because vascularity in the face, especially on the nose, is quite good, and you can take a chance with it. Here's one more patient who had an injury with a sickle. It's a very deep injury, and the CT scan showed that there is a fracture of the nasal bones. You can see that because the wound was open, we could, we could immobilize, stabilize the fractured nasal bones, bring it into position, and then suture the CLW with interrupted stitches. Very important to use interrupted stitches here because, if there is any chance of contamination, you are able to remove some of the stitches wherever you need, rather than having to have the whole entire wound unravel. And you can see the post-operative result. The scar is already settling pretty well at a very early time. And the shape of the nose, including the dorsum of the nasal bridge, is absolutely fine in spite of the nasal bone fracture. One more patient, this was referred to us from outside about 8 hours after the patient had injuries outside Mumbai. Somebody in a primary nursing or primary healthcare center had already put staples on it. And of course, staples leave terrible suture marks or staple marks. So we had to revise everything entirely. In addition, he had a fracture of the mandible. You can see that there is an malocclusion here. You can see the fracture very clearly in this particular X-ray. And then everything was revised. We used whatever suture material I talked about earlier, 6-0-ethylene or Prolene on the surface. And this is at 3 months post-op. Now, what about the timeline for suture removal? Here's a table that tells you the face, you must remove sutures as early as possible. Sometimes if you've done suturing in layers, you may remove them as early as 4 days. The back is the one where there is a lot of thick skin, and therefore up to 14 days. And the rest of the areas are, you can see, are between 7 days to 12 days. Now, I want to call your attention to this particular phenomenon, which is which plastic surgeons feel very strongly about. And these are what are called crosshatch marks. These are called staple marks or crosshatch marks. Staples, when put anywhere on the skin, should be removed on the 5th day. You wait for more than 5 days, then of course, the patient cares about the cosmetic result, and therefore this is what you can get if you do not remove staples after 5 days. And this, of course, are sutures which have been tied very tightly. You can see that there are actually crosshatch marks running across the suture line, and this is sometimes very, very difficult to revise. What about skin glues? I'm mentioning Dermabond straight away because I don't have any financial interest there, but it's octyl 2 cyanoacrylate. How does it help? Because, well, children are a little scared about having their wounds sutured, so it avoids anesthesia. And parents of today's day and age often tell me that psychological trauma. We grew up differently, but parents of this time always talk about the psychological trauma to the child. So you have to respect that. Skin glues are acceptable for superficial CLWs, but let me tell you that's not strong enough for any wounds which are deeper than subdermal. So the parents must be warned in advance that the scars will weaken and stretch as the child grows, and of course with time. However, you can have a nice via media. It's called a hybrid technique where you can do a deep layer suturing and then use Dermabond on the skin alone. And therefore, there are no sutures to be removed. So the child does not go through that psychological trauma at the time of suture removal. Some examples, Dermabond used on a superficial wound. You can see that it's at the end of 10 days, you can barely see the scar already. But this was just a very, very practically epidermal dermal wound, not deeper than that. However, this is a poor result with Dermabond. This child's parents insisted that the only thing I should do is just to put Dermabond. So I got the edges together, put Dermabond there, and you can see that this child has had a very poor result of the scar. Another patient, again, a stretch scar with Dermabond. If you look at it carefully, this is a stretch scar, but the parents were very, very, of course, they had taken the decision to use the Dermabond, and that's what I did. But the parents were quite worried about how this scar would affect the child psychologically, until the grandparents said that the child can make up his own decision about what to do about that scar when he grew up. This is a hybrid technique where a deep suture has been taken, and what you see here is not an hypertrophic scar. It's a layer of Dermabond, and then at the end of 12 weeks, you can see that the scar is practically invisible. And in an adult, especially in an area where it's hairy, like the eyebrow, you can do deep suturing and then straight away just put Dermabond there. The reason there is that when you take stitches on the skin, sometimes you can damage the hair roots. So an eyebrow is an excellent area where you can put a Dermabond there and you can get a pretty good result. There are, of course, commercial wound closure devices available in the market. They're ranging from about 700 rupees to 5,000 rupees if you want to use them. And the one that is usually available in India is what is called top closure. But once again, they're worthwhile probably for wounds which are at least only subacute deep. So you need to do deep suturing in a deep wound and then maybe use a top closure for the skin if you wish to. What about wounds with tissue loss? Here is where the plastic surgeon still, whether you like it or not, makes his entrance. In past times, attempts were usually made to try to close at all costs. And that is where the sequelae and the complications usually start. So it is my humble belief that it's prudent to call in a specialist in the acute setting, at least to assess and opine, and not after a few days of dressings. Please, if you don't mind. Wounds with tissue loss, very similar to what we talked about CLWs. It is vital to assess viable and non-viable tissues, note any exposed, injured vital structures, do an early debridement to healthy bleeding edges, do a thorough lavage. We talked about this earlier as well. Assess the undermining and the dead space, repair all deeper structures, and then take the decision about what wound cover you're going to give. Is it going to be a skin graft? Is it going to be a flap? Do you need to have a second look because the tissue has uncertain viability? Or do you want to wait till granulation develops and do something afterwards? So what are the indications for mandatory immediate primary cover? Well, very simple: exposed blood vessels, exposed nerves, exposed tendons, especially those devoid of paratenon, exposed bones and compound fractures. Again, when a bone is exposed, technically, if it's devoid of periosteum, yes, definitely you need some sort of primary cover. If it has periosteum, then theoretically speaking, only a skin graft may do. And of course, then exposed viscera and vital organs and exposed implants necessitate immediate primary cover. Once again, going to the reconstructed ladder, now we are one rung up. We're talking about split thickness skin grafts. So skin grafts will take well over a subcutaneous tissue bed. It will take well over fascia and it will take well over muscle. Will they take well over nerves, blood vessels, tendon and bone? Yes, we just talked about it. If there is paratenon, temporarily, yes, it will. If there is periosteum, yes, temporarily they will. And blood vessels, of course, but it is not going to be a durable cover. And you're asking if there is a possibility of secondary hemorrhage or something, then you're asking for trouble. Of course, temporarily, we have even put skin grafts over viscera. All of us have done that at some point in general surgery, but that's only temporary before a definitive wound cover is planned. Now, what about split thickness or full thickness skin grafts? Literally speaking, in acute wounds, there is no place for full thickness skin grafts. This whole slide, there's only one message: there is no place for full thickness skin grafts. A moderately thick split thickness skin graft will fulfill all the criteria of healing that a full thickness graft will give without any of its disadvantages. Some photographs now. This is a patient who has had some tangential wound over the nose. There are no vital structures exposed. Temporary dressing with collagen has been given, and this serves very well for about 7 to 8 days until you decide that you want to do a skin graft or some kind of flap if necessary. Another patient here, but once again, the emergency or the urgency has been tied over by just doing a skin graft here, you can see. And then for nasal reconstruction, a tissue expander has been put in. And the last slide shows that we've done a forehead flap from the expanded skin and the nasal reconstruction is done. But in the acute phase, only a skin graft was put, and that's perfectly acceptable. On the other hand, again, very similar nasal loss, but this patient insisted on definitive treatment in one go, and therefore a forehead flap has been done straight away. And you can see that's the forehead flap with the pedicle, and that's the flap settled at the end of a few weeks. Here the wound which was on the knee is a very innocuous wound, but it was referred to me after 12 days by the family practitioner, by which time this part of the wound, which was the original size, had contracted. And by that time, the parents were already asking why the wound had not healed. So he was referred to me, and then I just did a very simple split thickness skin graft. A case of electrical burns to the face. Once again, after debridement, thorough debridement, the patient, we were able to just get away with just skin grafts put over those areas. Cosmetically not very pleasing, but of course, cosmetically something else can be done later on. The important part is acute wound cover. One more case, deep burn over the right hand. This is a very inflamed hand. There's already a pus pocket underneath this. Very thorough debridement done in this area, you can see, but still no tendons exposed, luckily for this patient. And of course, then all we need is a split thickness skin graft. One more rung up the ladder, we go up to a random pattern flap. I'm nearing the end. May I have 5 more minutes, Dr. Kadam, Dr. Machiavel?
Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. So here's a wound with tissue loss in an 8-year-old child. You can see the exposed bone here. This is the rest of it is, of course, amenable to cover with a skin graft, but an elegant solution would be a full-fledged flap. You don't want to cover half with something and half with something else. So here's a nice big rotation flap which has been planned. You can see the flap that is being moved. And because it's such a huge rotation flap, there's really no secondary defect. This can be sutured by just pulling on the edges. And if necessary, just scoring the underside of the galea and the scalp opens up. So that's the result in this particular patient. There is some distortion of the hairline, but that can be taken care of later on. One more patient, he has referred to me on the 11th postoperative day. This is following a knee replacement surgery. This is something that orthopedic surgeons dread. You can see how the wound looks. This is after debridement and completely cleaning up the wound. A nice rotation flap has been taken. This is a random pattern flap, mind you. I will show you what I mean. This is a flap which has no real, this thing, it is really a wide base flap. There is no known vessel really which is supplying the flap, but it suffices to cover this area and make sure that the implant inside which is being used for the knee replacement is safe. One more patient, again an exposed implant referred by orthopedic surgeon on the 9th day. After full debridement and going back to normal good quality tissue, you can see that much more than just these 2 screws are exposed. And then a rotation flap has been turned from the dorsum of the foot that's already been marked here. And that's the flap raised, moved into the side of the defect. And of course, a transposition flap. And because it's a transposition flap, it leaves a secondary defect on the other side, which can very nicely be covered with a skin graft. Going further up to a pedicle flap, here's a thumb injury, a tendon is exposed. The tendon is not covered within 36 hours. You can let go of the tendon, say goodbye to the tendon and goodbye to flexion of the thumb in this particular case. So here is the debridement of the wound done. And this is what is called the first dorsal metacarpal artery flap. You may know it better as a cross finger flap wherein 3 sides are divided. Here, all 4 sides are divided and you use only a subcutaneous pedicle, which is the same pedicle as feeds the cross finger flap. And then that has been inset into the defect in this particular photograph. And then you can see the result at the end of a few weeks. Here's a patient who had this road traffic accident, and you can see the axillary arteries exposed here and the median nerve requires immediate coverage. Of course, you can probably put collagen there or probably try to move the muscles. But I think a very good, elegant solution for a definitive result is using a latissimus dorsi pedicle flap. A musculocutaneous latissimus dorsi has been used here, and you can see it inset into the defect, and that's the result. This is a skin graft that's been put over the donor side because we've used the skin as well. Going further up a reconstructive ladder, finally to the peak or to the pyramid, top of the pyramid, which is what is called microvascular free flaps. I'll just show you 3 or 4 slides of that. Here's a wound over a forehead referred to us within 2 hours of the injury. You can see that this part is devoid of periosteum and the rest of the area, including this area, has soft tissue on it. So we use what is called the lateral arm flap. That's the flap dissected. And that's the flap inset immediately at the end of surgery. And in this area where there are TIO dressings, we use skin grafts. That's the result at the end of 6 weeks post-op, a very well-settled flap. And you can see the areas of the skin graft. Those can be revised later and they can be converted to a fine scar. Another foot injury, again, exposed tendons. So obviously you require cover because otherwise you can't salvage the tendons. So you use the latissimus dorsi free flap covered with a skin graft. That's the final post-operative result and that's the donor side. Another patient referred to us within 2 hours. Again, a road traffic accident. You can see that it's a tangential cut. The carpals have been tangentially cut. You can see the cortex and the marrow inside. Here the metatarsals as well as part of the toes. We use what is called the anterolateral thigh flap, again as a free microvascular flap. That's the flap dissected. That's the flap inset immediately after surgery. And that's the result at the end of 6 months. So indications for NPWT. What are the indications? In acute wounds, really not so much. But I want to mention it because it is more and more getting important in our practice as well as your practice. So what are the indications? 1, wounds with tissue loss which are not suitable for primary repair. And what are those? Contaminated or dirty wounds, wounds requiring a second look or a secondary debridement, wounds with compound fractures, wounds with an expected heavy exudate, and wounds in patients with polytrauma who are in a poor general condition, so you cannot do a definitive surgery. One more use of NPWT or VAC is that it helps to facilitate adherence of skin grafts or wound. Use this once and you will be a fan forever, believe me. What are the contraindications? Well, any place where, you know, the hemostasis is poor and there is likelihood of bleeding, and where there is a potential for secondary hemorrhage. Wherever there are exposed vital structures, you cannot put VAC over it. And obviously, where there are exposed implants of foreign bodies, VAC has no role. Advantages, well, everybody knows this. It removes exudate from the wound, reduces the infective load, promotes growth of granulation tissue, facilitates wound contraction, and allows time for building up a patient. And this is what I mean. You can use VAC after putting a mesh skin graft, use it for 48 hours, and you will find that the skin graft take is almost always 100%. HBOT, well, I mean, we'll not talk about that much. Special circumstances, just 2 slides on this. Well, dog bites, we see quite a few of them. The animal needs to be assessed, whether it's a, it's a domesticated pet or a mongrel. You must do thorough debridement with lavage of the particular wound. And whether to suture or to not suture is really the $64,000 question. More often than not, you should suture if it's a domesticated pet who has been vaccinated. But at the same time, immunoglobulins and anti-rabies vaccine are just as important. So here's a child, a 1-year-old baby, terrible wound. It was absolutely impossible to suture this because it's potentially contaminated. We waited practically for almost 4 weeks before we could have a granulating wound here, even over the nose, before we just did skin grafting. Unfortunately, I misplaced the photograph, so I cannot show them to you. Here's a patient in a dog bite in an adult patient. You can see that the upper lip has been devastated in multiple layers right down to the level of the gums. And then if you suture this very nicely, primarily, and you give the patient rabies immunoglobulin and you give anti-rabies vaccine, and that's the way it's given. Immunoglobulin is given either equine or human, 20 units per kg or 40 units per kg, half in the wound itself, half in the deltoid, and then you have the regimen for ARV. I'll come to my final slide. We won't talk about this. I just want to summarize this. I'm running out of time and I hate that. To outgo my time. So yeah, one slide I want to talk about amputations because this is very dear to my heart as a microsurgeon. It is very, very important to know how to preserve a part. Never let a amputated part be directly in contact with ice. Please let me repeat that for you. Never ever let an amputated part be in contact with ice. Bring it in your pocket, bring it wrapped up in a gauze, bring it as you want, but never let it be in contact with ice because the amputated part contains water, it freezes, and then it is useless. Yeah. So preservation of part is the most important thing. Replantation time is different in different parts. The more proximal you go, the replantation time is less. For fingers, it can be as much as 8 to 12 hours. If you go to the arm, you have to do it within about 3 to 4 hours or so, revascularize the part. Dressings, I think Dr. Smriti already talked about. One last take-home message. Primary repair of wounds is the gold standard. Careful hemostasis, evacuation of clots, removal of contaminants and debris is essential. Freshening of edges and thorough debridement to a good bleeding margin. Tissue respect, tension-free suturing in layers, no dead space, preferably no undermining. And where primary repair needs to be deferred, please tend to the wound carefully with very, very basic dressings. Maintain a moist environment until the patient's hemoglobin and proteins can be improved. And then if you use the reconstructive ladder judiciously and if possible, involve a plastic surgeon in the management of wounds, it would be a nice thing to do. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Wagh. It was an excellent lecture. Dr. Matchwell, can you thank all the speakers? And
Being all of you, it's very good program today. I think the wound management and Dr. Wagh also given the entire clear picture about the plastic surgeon role of the acute wounds. So one thing I want to ask you now, you are telling the stapler has to be removed within 5 days. Now for abdominal wound and everything, we won't remove the sutures within 5 days. So what is for them? See, even incision wound also, surgical wound also, it's acute wound. It's not a permanent wound.
Yeah, so the way to do it is, you have to come as close to the skin as possible with your deeper layers. The subcutaneous layer has to be practically in the deep dermis. When you take your stitch, it has to come into the deep dermis. So there is no tension on the skin. If you are using the skin, the staple as a holder for skin, then that's not good. Well, I mean, you don't have to remove it in 5 days. You can remove it after 10 days. That is not an issue. I'm just talking about the cosmetic part because this will leave crosshatch marks.
Yeah. Hello.
Yes, please.
Yeah.
See, as you said, wax is not to be used where the viscera are exposed. We've been using wax for burst abdomen, isn't it? Where intestines are exposed. What is your take on it?
Ideally speaking, if you're doing it for the viscera, it's a relative contraindication. The best thing to do is to reduce the suction pressure even further. Wax acts best between a suction pressure of 80 to 120. If you're going to use it on viscera and you don't want any problems, then you must go to the lower range of that, which is about 80 millimeters of mercury, and it always must be intermittent wax. You cannot have continuous wax, so it's usually for the first 6 hours you continue, because that establishes a sort of pressure gradient in the wound, and then you do it an hour on, hour off, hour on, hour off, until you are it's being used. Yes.
Can I ask a question, Dr. Wagh?
Yes.
I wanted to ask you, you have mentioned that you like to go with traditional dressing materials, with gauze piece, impregnated with some Vaseline and things like that. Any of your experiences in using silicone, thin sheets of silicone to better the scar for primary suturing?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I was hoping that somebody would ask me that question. That's related to scars. So the first thing is that when you have repaired a wound for 3 weeks, whether the patient has hypertrophic tendencies or keloidal tendencies, do nothing. Never ever touch a well-sutured wound for 3 weeks. Why? Because all the silicone impregnated dressing materials also weaken the scar. In the first 3 weeks is when collagenation is maximum and the scar has to be strong enough. Once collagenation is maximum, then you have to see whether the timeline of how the scar is looking, the texture of the scar, the color of the scar, the thickness of the scar is with the timeline. A lot of scars will initially hypertrophy. At that point, you need to ask yourself whether the patient has an hypertrophic tendency or a keloidal tendency, whether there has been any infection in the wound or there has been a sort of a delayed repair of the wound, and then keep watching the patient for at least another week to 2 weeks. So now that takes us to about 4 weeks. At 4 weeks is when you finally decide whether you want to give the patient silicone sheets or a silicone gel. Silicone gel per se, the one that comes in a tube, it is absolutely useless.
No, sheets are available nowadays in the market. So
silicone sheets are available on Amazon as well. Yeah, yeah. And the ones to use are 1 millimeter sheets. Unless the patient has hypertrophic tendencies or you want to use them for keloids after injecting Kinacort, do not use 2 millimeter sheets, because they very quickly will weaken the scar. So use 1 millimeter sheets, and the way to use them is, it's a very, very nice way to remember them. For the first week, put them from sunrise to sunset. For the second week, you put them from sunrise to going to bed. For the third week onwards, you start using them as far as possible, 24 hours a day. The only time you remove them is when you take your bath. What this does is not anything related to the silicone. It is related to the gum. That's the same thing with our hypoallergenic tapes as well. It's related to the gum which is attaching that. Most of the gums that are available with silicone gel sheet cause allergies if you don't do this. So it gets the body or the skin used slowly to the silicone sheet. And never use a silicone sheet for more than 6 weeks at a time. At the end of 6 weeks, you need to take a trial about how the scar is appearing and keep it aside. Look at it for a week or so, see if it's all right, and then go forward.
Can I have a last question, please? For NPWT, we use it a lot during our surgical wounds. In Cooper, we're using a lot of it. I wanted to ask you, you mentioned it using it for the skin grafting. So do you decrease the pressure from 125 down to 90? So the same pressure holds true for skin grafting NPWTs?
Yeah, it is. See, there are very, very few indications where the pressure needs to go above 150 millimeters of mercury. Really highly exudative wounds in certain areas. Most of the time, the pressure should be between between 80 to 120. On the skin graft as well, just like I think Dr. Kadam asked me for the viscera, it's a very delicate structure. So you want to provide as much protection as possible. You don't want the whole thing to get sucked out. You actually want the capillaries to grow underneath and join together. So 75 is more than enough.
Yeah. Thank you all the speakers and the chairpersons.
So some closing remarks from Dr. Dalvi.
And
Rajesh.
I'll ask Dr. Dalvi to make the concluding remark, and then Dr. Niranjan would say the word.
I think one wonderful exposition of the two talks. I have gone on record. I could not hear Smruti. because I was busy, but I will go back and see the recorded version. I think the plastic surgeon has done a wonderful job for PGs to know what is a wound. And that is the basic thing that I think people should know. There is one wound which possibly he missed, or I don't know, it doesn't come into, is incise-like wound, which has something of forensic importance. It's usually caused by a blunt injury, and the hair follicles are destroyed. And that comes important when it may not change the treatment protocol, but definitely it matters when it goes to court of law. So thank you, Dr. Wagh, thank you, Dr. Smruti, and Aftab, thank you so much for wonderful lectures. It is, I have to congratulate Niranjan and Rajesh for pursuing this PG teaching in this bad corona 2 years loss for PG residents. And thank you, Chairpersons Dharmashri as well as Maxwell. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you, Dilvi sir. Thank you all the speakers and the chairpersons again. And for the delegates who are there, just to remind you, much more on the wounds will be discussed in the next Friday meeting, the venous wounds, as well as in the webinar on the whole day webinar on the diabetic foot and the pressure sores on 13th. So mark your dates again. And those who are not members of MSS, request you to be members of MSS as soon as possible. And since Milind is a guest today among the surgeons, he's a plastic surgeon, I would like to specially thank him, because in one go when I called him, he agreed to give this talk, and what a beautifully how he has covered the whole thing. So thank you everyone. Thank you all the speakers, and thank you Zuventus for supporting us.
Thank you, Zuventus.
Thank you to all the speakers. Thank you very much.
Take care and
Thank
stay
you.
safe.
Thank you, sir.
Be safe.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Good night.
Good night.